So, as I have stated before, I have, for lack of a better word, lived a very interesting life. Oh, the stories I can and will tell. For now, though, I will stick to the time I worked for a small Catholic newspaper. Now, just a disclaimer, I myself am not Catholic, but luckily, well, at first, that did not stop me from being hired. This was both a blessing in that it paid the bills and I got to do what I loved as the sole graphic designer, and a curse in that I worked with some over-the-top people, including one that kept trying to convert me, a woman who was the epitome of being a Karen years before being a Karen was even a thing, and a man who was a deacon who literally spearheaded a campaign with a subordinate of his to gaslight me, and then went on to harass another female worker as well, along with stealing commissions from yet another subordinate. This story involves the Karen, whom we will call Rachel, not her real name. Rachel had been hired as a secretary and additional receptionist. We were a small office of up to 10 to 12 people max at any given time. When she came on, she was married and had a child. Like me, she was initially not Catholic, but later became Catholic. I mention this because it is important in the grand scheme of things. See, the only reason she became Catholic, and she openly admitted this to me and others in the office who were all Catholic and had been for most of their lives, if not all, is because she found out that by her and her son being Catholic, she could get the church to foot the bill for her sending her son to a Catholic private school instead of a public one. She did this because she wanted a private education for her son, but didn't want to pay for it. So she went through RCIA and had him go through RCIC and the whole 9 yards, then told their church that they couldn't afford to send him to Catholic school and got the church to pay for it instead. Catholic churches will help parishioners who want to, but can't afford to send their kids to Catholic schools by paying for the school themselves, out of the money that has been donated by other parishioners. So she got what she wanted. This frustrated a fellow coworker when she found out, because she had been Rachel's sponsor and thought Rachel had been sincere in her wish to be Catholic. During this time, Rachel made it all but abundantly clear that she only played Catholic when she needed to, so as to get what she wants or needs, like that money for the school, but had no intention of actually living the life of a Catholic. Now, I had no intention of living life as a Catholic either, so I can understand that part. But then again, I never had any intention of becoming a Catholic, and they all knew this. Whenever Rachel's son needed to buy books or get money for extracurricular activities or lunch money or field trips, etc., Rachel would immediately go to her church's parish office, looking her poorest and most vulnerable, and ask them to cover the amount. And they always did. Again, off our fellow coworker who was a member of the same parish and had sponsored them. We all knew that Rachel's husband made a decent living, but apparently he either didn't know what she was really doing or didn't care. Due to what would happen a few years later, I am guessing that he didn't know and thought that his money was paying for the school and all the amenities, because while their son, who was a nice kid actually, and so was the husband the few times I met them, and he did love his family, was getting all this paid for by basically everyone else because of their poor status, Rachel was getting tanned and pampered. Yes. Rachel had started spending almost all her lunches either going to a tanning salon, getting 200, 300 manicures and pedicures, getting some tattoos on her ankles and wrists, getting her hair professionally done and kept up on a weekly basis, and getting spa treatments at least once every 2 weeks. Basically, all the money she spent on her own personal upkeep would have been more than enough to cover her son's schooling at the private Catholic school. What made it all the more ridiculous is that this woman went to tan so often that at one point she went past the normal orangish leathery look and started looking gray. I kid you not, she had gray undertones to her tanning. Not fully gray, just enough of a gray undertone to make several of us question if she was starting to turn into a zombie or something. I do think my coworker tried to tell the church, but without proof that Rachel was actively trying to scam them, and with Rachel proving that she was poor due to bills and them wanting to give her the benefit of the doubt, nothing ever came of it. It, of course, then came as no surprise, at least to me later, that she decided her husband no longer made enough money, was no longer worth her time, and decided to actively seek out an affair because she wanted something better solidified before fully giving up her cash cow, as it were. But that is another story that I will tell later. Update 1. 2 days later. So, I previously mentioned my coworker Rachel from when I was working at a small Catholic newspaper and how she had basically conned the church into footing the bill for her son's education, something she and her husband could afford to pay out of their own pocket while spending the money she had on herself. I mentioned that I did not and do not believe that her husband knew about this at the time, and here is the reason for that. I feel the need to once again reiterate the sheer entitlement of this woman. I mean, you could fill an entire mountain range with her entitlement and audacity. You see, as time went on and Rachel got more tanned, got her tattoos, which admittedly were nice ones, got her expensive manicures and pedicures, and her almost Karen haircut, etc., she also decided that her nice husband was just no longer worthy of her. She began complaining constantly about how he didn't make enough money, that she felt she was now too good for him, how she had previously dated a local well-known business owner that she was sure she could still have even though that business owner was married, not necessarily a lie, as everyone in the area knew this business owner had a propensity for having extramarital affairs, sort of an open secret. She then started bragging that she could have any guy she wanted, and would even mention that she was starting to go onto dating sites. This was back before Tinder and WhatsApp, when you had to use Match.com or eHarmony, etc. Of course, she would stop the cheating talk whenever her son was around. Since it was an individual building with a small staff and decent space, we were allowed to bring our children if needed, especially since everyone's children tended to be well-behaved and old enough to keep themselves busy, and no one really took advantage of this. So her son, who was a preteen, would come by the office after school on many days and wait for his dad to pick him up. During this time, however, while she would stop talking about cheating, she would still make thinly veiled insults and derogatory comments about her husband in front of their son, who would try to ignore her, but you could see he was uncomfortable with it. When her husband would come pick up their son, she would always find something to criticize the poor man over. He was a couple of minutes late. Literally, he was 2 to 3 minutes late once, and she blew up at him in front of everyone. He didn't pick up an earlier call fast enough. He was supposed to grab something from the store, but it was wrong. He wasn't dressed nice enough. He was in casual clothes on a day off, but it still looked decent. He was dressed too nice. If he had just gotten off work, he wasn't bright enough or smart enough, etc. I mean, this woman was doing everything in her power to emotionally wreck this man, who was a very nice man. She even stated that he was always treating her nicely, and it irritated her because it made her feel like he wasn't a real man, because he remembered birthdays, anniversaries, got her flowers or presents, etc. People, I wish I had a guy in my life that would treat me half as well as this man treated Rachel. This behavior would get worse all the time. At one point, she got mad and spent the entire day at the office ranting and raving because she tried to make him jealous over a stranger and he didn't attack the guy. That would be like common sense? BTW, her making him jealous was to gush over the way the guy looked. Instead, her husband just seemed defeated by her comments. By this point, she had eroded away most of his confidence and walked away. Now, by this point, she had really started running their finances into the ground with all her me pamperings and purchases, and he had finally started to notice and get some of his confidence back. He starts insisting that she cut back on spending. She can't stand for this, so she decides she needs a real man who makes real money and will lavish her with anything she wants at any given time. Enter AP. She finds the perfect patsy, if you will, though I still am not sure who was really conning using who in this relationship on one of her dating sites. Only problem is that he is from Canada and we are in the Midwest USA. So starts the long-distance, fully emotional affair. She would gush about him at the office, printed out photos of himself that he sent her, and talk about how wonderfully attentive he was, how attractive he was, and how rich and successful he was. Please note, this is important later. Now, I myself had been trying some online dating and even an in-person matchmaking business around this time, so I was already having enough issues with the messes I had to clean up from the creeps I kept attracting, some of which were downright frightening. So I admit that I was already jaded with the belief that there were a lot of scammers and liars that would use these venues to prey on easy targets. Thus, I was probably more than a little biased for this next part. Feel free to call me an AH for it, but I did not trust this man on any level. It took her a while to even get the first picture of him, and that first pic was almost a glorified headshot like you see in a school yearbook, only older like a teacher. It was apparently very recent, and he looked very healthy in it. Again, this is important later. She said he was just getting out of a long marriage himself and was going through a divorce, so he understood where she was coming from regarding her own currently still ongoing yet unhappy marriage. After a few months pass and many more pics of him looking fine and dandy, I come into the office one morning to see her standing by the copier in tears, utterly despondent. The reason? He had given her some bad news. Apparently, he had been trying to figure out how to tell her. He had brain cancer and 6 months to live. Yeah, again, I am probably the AH here, and definitely jaded by the liars I have encountered and seen my friends encounter, because I had an ex and 2 of my friends had exes by this point who had all 3, at different points in time, pulled the I have cancer card to either try to guilt us into continuing to date them after we had broken up, or in one friend's case, as an excuse to break up with her. Also, I have had previous coworkers and family with cancer, and when it got that serious, they did not look that healthy. I tried to tell her that, but she refused to believe me. She said he wanted to come see her soon so they could consummate their relationship before it was too late. So I just shut up about it, but refused to trust in this. I was positive that sooner or later the other shoe would drop. Anyway, she bought him tickets to come see her, paid for a hotel for him to stay in, etc. Now, remember that this guy was supposed to be rich and successful, but apparently all his money was tied up in his treatments, divorce, and all this other stuff, and he couldn't pay for anything. I began to see a bit of karma here. So he comes to visit, which did surprise me and make me feel a little bit guilty about thinking he may have been taking advantage of and scamming her, especially as he did actually match the photos he had sent. And she brought him to the office along with her son. Whoa boy. Remember the coworker from previously? Well, turns out that she was still having the church pay for their son's education. She was also spending more money on dating sites, and now she was paying to bring her AP from Canada once or twice a month for a weekend at a time. I guess he must have wanted to wait a while to get all his ducks in a row because he never actually confronted her about it. I do know she got a bit worried at one point that he was distancing himself from her and seemed to have become very cold, but she couldn't figure out why because she honestly believed, yes, she stated this, that he was too stupid to notice her having an affair. So one fine fall day it happened. I was in the back, in my office, eating lunch while reading the non-Catholic paper. As the graphic designer, I had a large room with 3 computers for my own workspace because it would become the space where we would put the paper together, and when deadlines would loom, several people might all be back there at once. So essentially, I had the largest office in the building all to myself most of the time. When the scream issued from up front. When I say everyone came running out, I do not jest. This scream had to have been heard in India, and it wasn't frightened or sad. It was indignant and angry. We rushed out to see a gentleman in a suit leaving the building, and Rachel clutching a batch of papers, red in the face and looking like she was trying to strangle a rock for blood. She had just been served divorce papers, and she was having none of it. Somehow, she managed to convince herself that she would be the one to serve them when she was ready, and she had not been ready just yet, because she was waiting for her AP to propose to her. He actually did propose to her a while later, again making me feel guilty for thinking he was a scammer. And with her own list of demands, etc., among the divorce papers was proof of her affair. Yeah, Rachel did not see that coming. Now, you would think that this would be the end, and that Rachel would be happy to let her not-worthy husband go so she could be with her perfect AP. But no, if that were the case, then Rachel would not be nearly the entitled person that she was. She was not going to go down without a fight. She was going to prove that she was the real victim in all this, even if it meant trying to commit fraud and trying to convince me to give her forgery lessons. But that, dear ones, is a story for another day. Update 2. 5 days later. Okay, I have mentioned my entitled coworker Rachel from my days working at a small Catholic newspaper before, but for this and upcoming stories, I think it is time to introduce the rest of the circus, as it were. The ones who were working there at this time are as follows. All names have been changed to protect both the innocent and the guilty. People who worked here prior to this, and people who started after this point will not be mentioned yet, as they are not relevant to the story at this time. The Archbishop, our publisher, who did not come to the newspaper office often and really doesn't feature in this story, but I wanted it understood that yes, there are 3 people that our editor answers to, as the newspaper is considered part of the Archdiocese organizational structure. The other 2 that the editor is also responsible for answering to are the Chancellor and Vice Chancellor, who work directly below the Archbishop but don't have any official newspaper title. Tom, our mostly beloved, if a little dense at times, editor-in-chief, who was suffering some serious on-off health issues, important as it explains why so many rotten things happened under his watch, which he had missed. Jane, our then assistant, or associate, as the title changed at one point editor, who also sponsored Rachel during her RCIA and switched to Catholicism. She was basically the one in charge at this time, as Tom was often out of office due to his health issues. Roger, a deacon and newly hired advertising executive who had not yet settled into his toxic, misogynistic, manipulative, thieving, gaslighting ways yet. He was still getting a feel for how much he could get away with, and Jane was still able to provide a nice buffer between him and me at this point. Lindsay, a writer-photographer. Marcy, a full-time employee who split her work between part-time writer-photographer as well as part-time advertising associate working under Roger. Rachel, a longtime receptionist secretary who shared duties with Gina and was extremely entitled. She had a soon-to-be ex-husband, STBX, a son, and an affair partner, AP. Gina, another receptionist secretary who shared duties with Rachel and had been working there for about 1.5 to 2 years by this point. Also worth noting that she was newly engaged to her longtime boyfriend, BF. Kathy, our office manager. And yours truly, me, the graphic designer. There were others who would come and go at this time, but they were usually either temps to help during peak printing times, freelancers who would help write take photos, or our IT guy who would come in as needed. Basically, none of them worked in the office on a regular basis. Anyway, I digress. When we last left off, Rachel had been served divorce papers at the office and she was livid to say the least. And she spent the next several days letting us know this. Every day, as she tried to get things organized, she was yelling, snapping, and throwing a fit at us, at customers, at advertisers, at pretty much everyone. She even verbally accosted a few priests and a nun to complain about her horrible husband and ask how she could stop this, since divorce is not readily recognized in the Catholic Church and an annulment is usually needed. Jane constantly had to tell her to cool it. At one point, she even started telling Gina that she should just break up with her BF and not get married, as marriage was horrible, men were horrible, she wouldn't be able to trust her husband and would just be worthless like all the others. Mind you, she was still singing the praises of AP at this point. Well, Jane finally had enough, and the next time Tom was in, Jane went to him about all this. Because Rachel was actively trying to undermine Gina's engagement, and it was making Gina very uncomfortable. And Gina didn't even talk about it all that much, but even the sight of her engagement ring would set Rachel off. So Tom called Rachel into his office and basically told her that she had 2 choices. She could stop snapping at everyone and stop trying to convince Gina that marriage was bad, or she could just quit now, because if she didn't stop those 2 things, she would be fired. She was smart enough to know that while Jane did not have the authority to fire her, Tom did and would. So she stopped snapping so much and stopped deriding marriage in front of Gina. You'd think it would be all good at that point, right? We would finally get a break from all the drama? Nope. Get your popcorn out, folks, because things were about to hit the fan. Rachel had decided to take all her pent-up anger and frustrations and laser focus them onto one goal and one goal only. She wanted revenge. So she decided to put all, and I mean all, her energy into making her STBX the most miserable man on earth, though I am pretty sure that by this point she had already previously succeeded. Now, STBX, not being nearly as stupid as Rachel thought, did stay in the house, and Rachel was the one forced out. So she went to stay at a hotel. I believe it was one of those where you could basically rent it like an apartment for a week at a time, no lease needed, and a kitchenette included. And they also split custody of their son 50-50 during this time. But her being without her house, her access to his money, as he had cut her off from his paycheck, with the exception of a small bit for child support even though he was not required yet, and her having to use her own money to buy things all just added fuel to the fire of her wanting to get back at STBX. Though it was not initially much of a revenge plan, as it basically consisted of her trying to take him for everything he owned under the guise of deserving both alimony and child support, and was positive she could get full custody and the house. She decided that while tanning and constant haircuts dye jobs were a continued must, she would forgo the weekly mani-pedis and twice-monthly spa treatments. Instead, she started looking for lawyers, any that would explain to her that she was highly unlikely to get alimony under the circumstances, as she had been employed for several years, was not a stay-at-home mom, and had a good enough skill set and work history to remain employed or get a new job. She would dismiss from consideration almost immediately. She was going to get her alimony. She did eventually settle on a lawyer who was willing to do what she asked and try to bilk him for everything. So with that done, she started gathering all financial records, all past bank accounts, all information she could get. She started bringing all of this paperwork to the office, and anytime the phones weren't ringing or she didn't have a specific job she had to do, she would instead pour over all this information. And that was when it happened. We were on the second day of deadline. Our newspaper deadlines lasted 3 days usually, and I had just finished pasting in ads to some of the pages. We had not yet gone fully electronic for our printing yet, so some ads needed pasted onto the hard copy. Now Jane, who would sit in the back with me when I would lay out pages so I knew what stories needed to go on what pages, had gone back to her desk, so I was back there by myself. Rachel came up to me in a bit of a rush, waited for me to turn to her, and shoved 2 papers in my face and asked, "OP, do these 2 signatures look the same?" I asked what this was all about, and that is when she told me. She had been getting some of STBX's mail, and among them was a bank statement from a bank that STBX had not used for years. It turned out that he had an account there back when he was in college, before they married, that he had let go into stagnation when they did get married, because they had combined finances and opened up a joint account at another bank. Apparently, at the time, he had less than $1 in the account and figured they would just automatically close it after a set time, so he wouldn't have to worry about it, which, for that time period, was normal for accounts under a certain amount. What neither of them knew was that after he had stopped paying attention, the school had apparently found a payment error and refunded him a few $1,000s. Not much, but enough that when, years later, after having a lawyer going over everything in search of anything she could use, Rachel had found out about this long-forgotten account, and she had called the bank. Since she was still his wife legally, she gave them his name with her address so that she could get a statement as to what was still in the account. Her plan was to perfect his signature and send in the paperwork for them to send her a check or transfer it into her new single bank account. I tried to explain to her that I did not think it would work and why. 1, he would sooner or later figure it out. She was insistent he wouldn't, and because he had forgotten he even had this account, let alone knowing it had any money in it, that they would want to talk to him or see him in person, and she said she could just have AP pose as him over the phone as she had STBX's SSN and other info that she could have AP give them, and that it wouldn't be able to be in person anyway because it was in a completely different state, half a continent away. She was positive there was no way she could get caught. But she really needed me, as an artist, to show her how to forge his signature properly. WTF? Yes, I probably could have technically shown her and or done it if I had wanted to, but no. As I said before, I don't like the idea of being in jail. I don't want to risk that. My sister once told someone that if she was going to go to jail, it better be for a payout of millions, and even that would still not be enough. I feel the same. Especially since I was a single mom to a 6-year-old kid myself at the time, who was helping care for her disabled parents. So I simply told her no, that I could not and would not help her. Now, Jane had come back by this point, as Rachel had taken the no and somberly gone back up front mumbling about doing it herself and trying to figure out how to get the money. Jane looked at me and asked what that was about, and I told her. She looked at me as though my head had just flown off. She was like, "Wait, she asked you to commit a crime?" I said, "Well, technically, she asked me to abet a crime she would be committing." Jane was not happy for several reasons. She said that this was beyond unacceptable and would talk to her. I told her that it was unnecessary, as I had already told Rachel no, and that she would most likely get caught anyway, but Jane insisted that she shouldn't have even asked me in the first place. So she did talk to Rachel, and while Rachel didn't actually apologize, she didn't get angry at me. She did come back, though, to bitch about how Jane had apparently overheard our conversation and yelled at her for that, saying she was not to ask people to take part in illegal activities for her divorce ever again. Thank you, Jane, for not ratting me out. Jane admitted later that since Rachel hated her by this point anyway, she saw no reason to cause more drama with the truth, so she told Rachel she had heard the entire conversation from the hallway, taking the full brunt of Rachel's anger. Rachel never did ask me about forgery again, though, and while I do not know whether she got that money or not, it was never mentioned after that. She continued on with insisting on getting what she wanted, and that was bleeding STBX dry. Spoiler alert, she didn't. She did get some small amount of child support, but that was only because she got 60-40 custody, I think, but no alimony. She also did not get the house or all the other things she thought she was owed. She did eventually get engaged to AP, who was now allowed back at the office during his visits, should he be visiting during that week, but only to pick her up or drop her off, and showed up with a large shiny engagement ring. No, I don't have proof that he paid for it or that it was real, so there was still possibility of scamming, since she was not divorced yet at the time the engagement occurred. But by this time, Rachel's time at the paper was starting to run its course. She was burning bridges, as it were, and when she went to leave the office one day, she did not pay attention to where she was backing up and backed into Gina's fiance's car. Gina had borrowed it and came running in demanding that Gina and her fiance pay for the damages to her car or she would sue. Worth noting here that Gina's fiance was a lawyer. It was shortly after this incident that Rachel's time at the paper ended because no one was willing to put up with her entitled nonsense anymore. No, I do not know what happened to her after this. Facebook was not a thing yet, or if it was still college students only, and she did not keep in touch with any of us. In fact, she was cussing up a storm as she left, most of it directed at Tom, Jane, and Kathy, I think, some at Gina and Roger, and thus ended the saga of Rachel, and started a whole other saga of an ongoing fight between Tom and Jane, and eventually led to Roger's decision that it was perfectly fine to gaslight me because I was apparently too good at my job. But those are stories for another day. Edit. Wow. So some people suggested that I should Google Rachel and see if she is married. Still married to the AP. So I looked up some old issues of the Catholic paper, couldn't remember her last name offhand, and I had forgotten that she had managed to marry him before she was fired, but she had his last name during her last bit of time there. Okay. So I looked up her name with the newly married name, and OMG, I wish I had not. Here is the most concise update I can give to what happened after she was fired. She still has the AP's last name and is still using it as of 4 years ago. The most recent info I could find on short notice. Don't know if they are actually still married or not, but I can say that 4 years ago there was a road rage incident of which I am loath to put details here, as this is considered a crime. Let us just say that she was fine, but others were not so lucky, and her life has definitely gone downhill. I am not the OOP